Welcome to this first of two lectures related to public library development in the UK. Lecture 1 focuses on the early history and development of public libraries and also considers the notion of the library faith. For those of you who don't know me, my name is David McMenemy and I'm a lecturer in information science and Deputy Director for Postgraduate Teaching at the University of Strathclyde. My research interests encompass issues around information law and ethics, including intellectual freedom and freedom of expression, as well as freedom of access to information, privacy, and the philosophy of information. As well as I've extensively researched around public library policy and development in the UK, including writing the book The Public Library, which was published by Facet in 2009. In terms of the overview of this lecture, we will firstly discuss the early antecedents of the public library, the implementation of the 1850 Act, philanthropy and pre-war development, the Micawber Report and post-war development, and we will conclude by discussing the notion of the library faith. In terms of the early antecedents of the public library, we can have four main categories that we should consider. Firstly, subscription libraries, Mechanics' Institute libraries, libraries set up by local philanthropists, and last but not least, parish libraries. Now, there is some debate as to where the first public library was set up, but most people agree that Coventry in 1601 was the first public library that we could really consider being publicly accessible. Subsequent libraries were created in Norwich in 1608, Bristol in 1615, Leicester in 1632, and the famous Chethamd Library in Manchester in 1653, and this latter library is still in existence today and is still very popular. In terms of the categories we discussed earlier, the first category is subscription libraries. Now, these libraries were libraries where members normally paid a fee to borrow books. The majority of these kinds of libraries saw dwindling memberships after public libraries became more common. Quite a famous brand, for instance, that were subscription libraries was Boots, who actually had subscription libraries within their shops. And these were quite common up until the 1950s. Perhaps the most famous remaining example of a subscription library is the London Library, which was formed in 1841 by Thomas Carlyle. And this library is still in existence and again is still very popular and well used. Mechanics' institutes are traceable to the work of Professor George Birkbeck in the early 19th century. Now, what Professor Birkbeck did was start to basically have public lectures that mechanics and engineers and other members of the public that were suitably minded to attend the lectures could come along to and hear state of the art in terms of research. Now, the popularity of these lectures led to many cities having mechanics institutes formed, where engineers and mechanics could hear lectures on technical subjects, as well as borrow books. Now, the mechanics institutes were very popular, and there were 700 of them in the UK by 1863. Again, public libraries led to mechanics institutes dwindling in terms of their popularity, but they were an important catalyst for public library development. Now, the public library movement was very important in the early part of the 19th century. You can basically connect the public library movement to part of the wider social improvement movement of the same period. There was a major concern with what were perceived as immoral activities of working classes. The notion was that we should allow working classes to better themselves through access to high quality literature and knowledge, and draw their interests from other pursuits. So in terms of how the 1850 Act came about, there was a first unsuccessful step to create an act taken in 1835 by John Silk Buckingham, a Sheffield MP. This failure, however, did inspire other social reformers, and William Ewart and Joseph Brotherton, both MPs, took up the mantle. They joined forces with Edward Edwards, an assistant at the British Museum Library, to campaign for a Public Library Act. So, in 1849 a select committee was formed, and the role of the committee was to determine the best means of extending the establishment of libraries freely open to the public, especially in large towns in Great Britain and Ireland. Brotherton and Ewart were both members of the committee, and Edwards was a key witness, and they met to gather evidence from March to July 1849. They produced a 450-page report recommending a public libraries bill. There were several arguments within the report for the provision of public libraries. One of the main ones was that British culture was lagging behind foreign rivals. A quote directly from the report sums this up. "While we learned that, more than half a century ago, the first step taken by a foreign writer was to consult a public library on the subject of his studies or composition, we find that no such auxiliary was at the service of the British intellect." Now this argument is clearly related to the status of Britain, and bear in mind this was the high period of the British Empire, so there was a significant concern that British culture was being left behind by other countries who were providing these kind of resources for their population, and this was a major concern. Other arguments related to the improvement aspects of public libraries, the ability to improve things for wider society. Citing the example of Peebles Library in Scotland, the report suggested that the library had promoted literary taste and temperate and moral habits among the inhabitants. Now this argument is really related to how the population was seen to be using its leisure time. So the idea being that public library provision could help them use their leisure time in better ways. Another argument related to how public libraries could perhaps provide access to better materials than the population was consuming at the time. Again, another quote from the report says, "It is also truly observed that the establishment of such depositories of standard literature would lessen, or perhaps entirely destroy, the influence of frivolous, unsound or dangerous works." Now here is the concern with what are deemed to be less worthy materials, less worthy literature. And this is actually something that has been a debate that's pervaded public libraries even up to this date, as we'll see in Lecture 2. A further quote from the report states that, "Shall we therefore abandon the people to the influence of a low, enfeebling, and often pestilential literature, instead of enabling them to breathe a more elevated and more congenial atmosphere?" Now, again, here we see this concern with the leisure interests of the population leading them to read materials that were deemed to be bad for them. And again, this is an argument that we see repeated throughout the history of public libraries. What types of material should public libraries provide? Should they provide fiction? Should they provide what's deemed as low quality fiction? These are considerable arguments even to this day, and we'll talk about these in more detail in the second lecture. Now, the 1849 Select Committee report led to the 1850 Public Libraries Act, and this act received royal assent in August of that year. The act stated that town councils could levy a tax of half a penny to pay for accommodation and upkeep of a library. Importantly, it had to be voted for, and a 2/3 majority of the population of a community had to be in favour. Also importantly, books could not be purchased with these funds. They had to be donated by the local community. Now, this 1850 Act was extended to Scotland and Ireland in 1853. It's really important for us to remember the legacy of the public library reformers. In 1956, Lionel McColvin summarised what he thought were the 5 main contributions that were the legacy of the public library reformers of the 1840s and 1850s. Firstly, that public libraries should be publicly funded. And again, if we remember, the categories of library before public libraries existed were subscription libraries, Mechanics Institute libraries, parish libraries, and libraries donated by philanthropists. Now, none of these were publicly funded. So the fact that we now have a network of libraries that are publicly funded is an important legacy of that era. The second point was that they should be administered by public bodies and not private organisations or individuals. Now again, you might consider, well, why is that important? Well, the public bodies that administered them could be seen to be neutral. Private organisations or individuals are not necessarily so. So again, that's an important legacy. Whether we live up to that or not is a different question, but it is an important aspect of the legacy of the reformers, that a neutral public state should provide the libraries for the benefit of everyone, and not at the whim of an organisation or an individual. The third point McColvin made was that they should be freely available to all members of the community. And again, he saw this as an important legacy. this aspect that the libraries were for everyone is a really important point that we sometimes take for granted. The fourth part of the legacy that McAuliffe highlighted was that libraries should embrace the needs and interests of all members of the community. So again, that inclusiveness aspect, that really public libraries are there for everyone, not small cliques of people, but the entire community. Last but not least, McAuliffe thought a major part of the reformist legacy was that libraries should be free both financially and intellectually, and provide access to materials without bias or interference. And again, this is something we perhaps take for granted, but it's a fundamentally important point for the provision of public libraries in a democratic state. That the finance should be free, and access to materials should be free and not influenced by any bias or interference. Again, you could argue whether or not we live up to that or not, but in terms of that being a legacy of the reformers, it's a very important point, and it's a very crucial aspect of what we see the public library in terms of its role for society. In terms of the development of the libraries post the 1850 Act, it is important to recognise that there wasn't some mad rush to take up the provisions of the Act within communities. 35 years after the Act, in 1885, only 25% of the British population had a public library, and that was even lower in Scotland, where the figure was only 8%. Now, the Act was amended several times in the following decades to reduce the population level necessary for the pool of population, and also increase the rate that could be levied to 1 penny. The levy maximum rate was abolished in 1919. Another important aspect of public library development in the UK was philanthropy. Andrew Carnegie's influence was pivotal in expanding the number and the quality of public libraries, not just in the UK but across the world. Carnegie was born in Dunfermline, and this is where he actually set up his first public library. He opened this in 1883. Now, many of Carnegie's libraries still exist today, which again shows the quality of the build and the resources that were invested in them. Carnegie was responsible for funding something like 3,000 public libraries across the world. And it really is a big question. Without that kind of patronage that Carnegie provided, would the public library network exist as it currently does? It's very questionable. Another important development in public libraries in the UK was the Micawber Report. The real title was The Public Library System of Great Britain. Now, Lionel Micawber was a librarian, and he was commissioned by the then Library Association, which is now obviously part of CILIP, in 1942 to look at the state of public libraries across the UK. Now, this was an extremely extensive study, and the report itself was highly idealistic, and really what it was doing was focusing on the potential of public libraries for the UK. Now, Micawber was extremely critical of what he saw as a fragmented structure that was in place at the time, and the variance in service quality across the UK. Although the notion of a postcode lottery wasn't really something that was considered at the time, really that's what he was talking about. You would have a huge variance in perhaps rural areas versus big city areas, and even some big cities were different. You had some large reference libraries like Glasgow, Liverpool, Manchester, that had significant collections, and other smaller areas that had really poor collections. So what he wanted was some consistency in terms of provision for people. One of the main recommendations that Micawber made was a reduction in the number of library authorities from 604 at the time to 93 to allow focus on service delivery. Another crucial development post-war was the 1964 Public Libraries and Museums Act. To this date, that remains the legislation that governs libraries in England and Wales, so that is therefore a very important act even now. What the Act specified was that local authorities must provide comprehensive and efficient library services. Now, the comprehensive and efficient phrase is something that has provoked much debate. Is it meaningful enough? Does it actually provide enough guidance for libraries to understand what the terms mean? But importantly, the Act also stated that the Secretary of State had oversight over the service and superintended the sector. So if a library service was underperforming, the Secretary of State could intervene within that service and take over the running of the service. In Scotland, the appropriate legislation is contained in the Local Government Scotland Act 1973. We'll talk more in the next lecture about some of the provisions of the Act itself related to reading, etc. So what of the public library in the modern era? Is it really a question of faith in a Victorian notion of self-improvement? Do the original arguments for public libraries about self-improvement, about providing access to the best literature, etc., do they still hold water? Or is it really a question of faith in a Victorian notion of self-improvement that is no longer relevant? And these are major questions we always have to ask ourselves when it comes to advocating and justifying public libraries. The library faith itself was a term coined by Henry Garceau in 1949 as part of the American Public Library Inquiry. He defined it as a fundamental belief so generally accepted as to be often left unsaid, in the virtue of the printed word, the reading of which is good in itself, and upon the preservation of which many basic values in civilization rest. He went on to say, when culture is in question, the knowledge of books, the amount of reading, and the possession of a library all become measures of value, not only of the individual, but also of the community. Now, the notion of the library faith was also something we saw from UK writers in the same period. L. Stanley Jast said, wherever there is civilization, there must be books. Wherever there are books, there must be libraries. And Lionel McColvin again said that no other equalities can avail if access to so important a means of individual development is not full and universal. Importantly, another writer in the Public Library Inquiry in America, Lee, said that the specific virtues to be promoted by the reading of books and, therefore, libraries, have varied in rough correspondence with the general outlook or zeitgeist. So one way we could interpret that comment is that perhaps the arguments that we had for public libraries in 1850 and even in the 1950s are perhaps no longer relevant to us. We need to think up new ways of articulating the value of libraries to let politicians and others understand why they are valuable. Now, there have been voices for change in the UK. Successive UK governments have called on public libraries to transform in different ways. Added to this was the voice of certain special interest groups seeking to a rethink in how public libraries are administered and what their role is. All arguably closely mirror the movement to a more consumer-minded society as opposed to one that's civic-minded. Now, in terms of the arguments from the right of the political sphere, they argue that the services public libraries provide are consumer-based and should be part of the market. They rely on a certain blind faith in their worthiness for their existence. And they cost the public purse as well as authors and publishers vital revenue. For example, a report in 1986 by Adam Smith Institute said that public libraries are perceived as desirable institutions by a largely uncritical man in the street. It is a position few other areas of the public sector enjoy, and one that is less easy to justify. The report goes on to say that those who benefit from libraries are those who use them. It seems only right that they should pay for the benefits they receive, rather than be subsidised by the rest of society, or, indeed, by those whose works they borrow rather than buy. So, the arguments from the left take a different critique on libraries. Some people from the left argue that public libraries are elitist institutions serving a largely middle-class audience. Buildings and collections are off-putting and project an old-fashioned image. And services need to be targeted more at people in need than those who are not in need. One example of this was the Micawber Report by Muddiman et al. In 2000. And this was a 1998 to 2000 study into social inclusion. Again, it argued that public libraries were mainly middle-class in clientele. And there was a take-it-or-leave-it attitude, which meant that libraries were failing to achieve social inclusion. By that, the report meant that, there was a one-size-fits-all service, that if it didn't fit your needs, then really you had to lump that. They also argued that the particular needs of specific excluded social groups and communities were different, and therefore had to be acknowledged as being different. They argued it's not possible in the end to reduce them and try to find one universal solution for all excluded communities. And these concerns, I think, are concerns that we take into consideration in modern service provision. This notion that a one-size-fits-all service is really relevant in the modern age is probably not something that many people will defend anymore. In terms of how we could summarise the arguments from both the left and the right, They do mirror similar ideas if not solutions, namely that firstly, public libraries are too middle class and elitist, that they don't deliver services the vast majority of the UK public want, and that buildings are old-fashioned and project a dated and exclusive image. Now, whether you agree with these criticisms or not, you have to acknowledge them and be able to rebut them, because obviously, if the sector is under criticism from either of these standpoints, you need a good defence to say, well, why these arguments are incorrect. So just to finish off, what of value? So is Garceau's notion of a library value no longer enough? Is the library faith something that we can still stand behind? Perhaps yes, but it's also important to remember that how we measure libraries has changed, and we're utilising much more both economic and popularity statistics to justify our library services. So examples from the economic side of things would be things like return on investment and contingent valuation. Contingent valuation relates to the notion that services have non-use values, so people would value a library or a museum or any public service from the basis that how much it would cost them to buy that service if it was part of the market. But also the notion of popularity is something that's important to consider. The statistics and usage for public libraries are still extremely high, and these are important statistics we can use for advocacy to justify why public libraries still have a major impact on society. And that leads to the final point. There's a much enhanced focus recently that relates to the impact of library services on the community. And this is something I think that will grow and grow, and something we have to be aware of and understand, and try to measure as much as we can. So that short lecture basically discussed a little bit of the development of public libraries, some of the key themes that we have to consider when managing libraries in terms of advocacy. In the next lecture, we'll discuss much more the notion of who public libraries are for, and can they really be services that provide services for all.